Well, good to be back with you this evening. We've had a couple of weeks, haven't we? Had a weather delay and a weather cancellation, and then the today service. So it's been a little bit since we've been able to get together. I'm going to finish up the book of Exodus tonight. And I think in the future, I'm just going to keep walking through the Pentateuch for a little bit. So we'll do a Leviticus. I think I'm just going to do 1 week on Leviticus. I think that's enough. 1 week on Leviticus. My major professor would be very disappointed in me for only doing 1 week. He wrote the commentary on Leviticus, which is great. He did a great job. And I have changed my opinion about Leviticus, which I got from my grandfather. Papa used to say that you need to read the book of Leviticus right before you go to sleep at night, so there's nothing on your mind. But I have since changed that, and I do like Leviticus now more than I used to. But we'll do that, and then a little bit of Numbers and Deuteronomy. I think that the way I've looked at it, we could probably go all the way to get a pretty good survey through Joshua and Judges even by the time we get to summer. So just kind of skip a rock across the pond and hit some of these later ones. Did a whole semester on Genesis, but I can just skip a little bit on some of these other books, and I think it'll be good to take us into that. And then in the fall we'll pick up something else, maybe a book study of some sort. But that's where we are right now. But finishing up Exodus tonight. Anything I need to say before we get going? I don't think so. I haven't done this in a little bit. Forget what I did. But let's look at Exodus 24. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to take for me an offering from all those whose hearts prompt them to give. You shall receive the offering for me. This is the offering you shall receive from them: gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linens, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, fine leather, acacia wood, oil for the lamp, spices for the anointing oil, and fragrant incense, onyx stones, gems to be set in the ephod for the breastpiece, and to have them make for me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them in accordance with all that I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so you shall make it." So God says, I want an offering from the people as their hearts lead them to give from this list. These are the things that they're allowed. Not to take in anything. This is not old refrigerators and your old old couches. What was that, Bob?
Gift registry.
There's a gift registry. That's right. God has registered with for the tabernacle, and this is what He wants. But I do think it's interesting that it's a willing contribution. Right? He's not demanding these things. He's asking that the people give as.
I looked up there and I glanced and I thought, 5 tanned ram skins. Boy, that's then I realized that's the verse.
It is 5 tanned ram skins. Yes. That's all I need. You know what? Just 5. I think. I only need 4, but no. Probably more than that. But this is, of course, the building of the tabernacle, which is still an amazing thing to me, that God wants them to build this tent. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not clear about the acacia wood. What is it used for?
The acacia wood? It's going to be part of the walls inside.
It's very sturdy wood.
Relatively, yeah. It's not balsa wood, but it's not hardwood either, but it'll work. The tabernacle, Mishkan in Hebrew, this is it means dwelling place. The word, you might notice in Mishkan, you can kind of see the consonants here, Shekan. If you ever heard of the Shekinah glory, that phrase Shekinah glory comes from this Hebrew word, Shekan. So this is the dwelling of place of God's glory that we're looking at. It's descending in this place. The tent of meeting, the Ohel Ma'od, that's one of the favorite intro Hebrew words for students. They learn the word tent is Ohel, and you can't keep them together after that. The students just go crazy when that happens. But it's the Ohel Ma'od, the tent of meeting, that this is where God's going to dwell. This is a radical idea. Gods live on mountaintops, right? Gods live in inaccessible places. God lives in the heavens. And yet here, the God of Israel says, okay, I need you guys to build me a tent because I'm going to go camping with you in the desert. A portable deity is as countercultural and radical as you can imagine in the ancient Near East. This was not something anybody else had. Gods had regions. You can remember that when we were in Genesis, when Jacob wakes up at Bethel and he says, wow, Yahweh was in this place and I didn't know it. Because he thought he could get away from the influence of Yahweh. Different regions, you have the gods of Israel and the gods of Egypt and the gods of Babylon, the gods of Canaan. God says, no, I'm just going to move around with you people. It's going to be portable, it's just God's desire to dwell with God's people is the theme throughout the text, whether it's in the garden or in ultimately Revelation, spoiler alert. in Revelation. That's the goal of God, to dwell with God's people. So, really kind of cool. Your thoughts or questions? Yeah, good.
New Testament question.
Sure.
Beginning of John.
I don't accept New Testament questions. No, go ahead.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among
And
us. My
tabernacled
understanding
among us. Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah. Well, it's the same. It's the
Is it
same.
Septuagint?
It's the Greek word that is used to translate
That-
Mishkan
yeah.
from Hebrew.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. Well, let's talk more about this. Tabernacle, I think, is important, and it's going to contrast with one of the big failings of Israel in just a second. Tabernacle was God's idea, it was God's initiative, it was God's design. This was all God's putting it together. The people didn't come up with any of how God had the registry list, God has the blueprints, and I will say, this is among the more boring sections of the book of Exodus to read. This is when the Bible starts to seem a little harder. I mean, if you fought through all of the genealogies in Genesis, for the most part, you still got some excitement there, right? You've got people killing people and sneaking off with people and doing other things with people. And then in Exodus, it's really exciting because you got miracles and plagues and floods and the waters are parting and God speaking from mountains. And then God begins to describe the blueprints of his plan for this tent. And it's about as exciting as someone reading blueprints to you. And some of you may like that kind of thing, but it's pretty dry in this section. And it is, but this is God's design, God's initiative. So we get this portable tent. It contains the Ark. It's going to have the Ark of the Covenant in it, which have the covenant commandments. And it's going to have an incense altar. It's going to have an altar out front to offer sacrifices on. It is going to be the place you can get to God. So the meeting place between God and God's people here, which is dangerous. If God's living in your area, God is holy and we are unholy, and so you can have some problems, and God brings that up in Exodus 33. Don't forget, I'm holy, and you're not holy, and this could get rough. But it's sanctified, it's set apart, and everybody ends up contributing to the tabernacle. Doesn't matter. I mean, some people gave wealth, some people were skilled craftsmen, but everybody was able to use the gifts and talents that they had to contribute to the building of this place, which is really a very beautiful thing, I think, when you look at the tabernacle. So, I think I want to say one more thing about it. Yes, the Lord spoke to Moses. See, I've called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, the tribe of Judah. I filled him with the divine spirit. Notice God's spirit now comes on the people. With ability, intelligence, knowledge of every kind of craft, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, bronze, and cutting stones for setting, and carving wood of every kind of craft. Moreover, I've appointed with him Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, not a really common name that you see. I mean, a lot of Jacobs and Joshuas in the world, but you don't see a lot of Ahisamachs. It's a shame. Anyway, of the tribe of Dan, I've given skill to all the skillful so they may make all that I've commanded you, the tent of meeting, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat that's on it, that's where the angels are touching, and all the furnishings of the tent, the table, its utensils, the pure lampstand with all its utensils, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering with all its utensils, the basin with its stand, finely worked vestments, holy vestments for the priest Aaron, the vestments for his sons for their service as the priest, and the anointing oil, the fragrant incense for the holy place. They shall do just as I have commanded you. So the Spirit of the Lord moves on these people, these special, gifted, called out people, Bezalel and Oholiab. There are a lot of creation images in the story of the building of the tabernacle. So I'm going to do what I can to help redeem these blueprints a little bit for you. Yahweh gives 7 speeches about the tabernacle. That's a significant number whenever it occurs. You get 7 speeches here. The Spirit of God fills these 2 men. The tabernacle is dedicated on New Year's Day, which is the first day of creation, the day let there be light. That's in the Jewish tradition. There are cherubim represented. There's a tree of life represented. There's gold. There's jewels on the high priest. The entrance comes in from the east. All of those things are connected to Genesis 2, the Garden of Eden story. The tree of life and the different stones that are talked about, the entrance being in the east, all of that connected to creation images. I love this quote from Terence Fredheim. Worship at the tabernacle is a way for the community of faith to participate in the divine creational work. This is a new creation. And I think that it's important to remember when we talked about Genesis 1, there was so much temple imagery in the Genesis 1 story. Some of you who've been with us that long remember we talked about the Genesis 1 being the image of God's creation of a temple, the universe as temple. And the last thing you do when you build a temple is you put an image of the God in the temple. That's what God is doing in Genesis 1. That's what's going on there. So that the images, this is the place where God dwells with humanity. And Tabernacle is doing that exact same thing, right? It's going to be this place where God dwells with humanity. It's a more creational work. I mean, ultimately, at the end of this story, in Revelation, the New Jerusalem is oriented exactly like the Holy of Holies is in the temple. It is a cube. And the reason the New Jerusalem is a cube is the image is that's the Holy of Holies of this greater creation temple that is the rest of the universe. And God dwells perfectly with God's people in that New Jerusalem, that new Holy of Holies for this rest of this creative universe. So it's all creation and dwelling is intertwined in these images throughout this. So I'm all over the Bible tonight, but any questions or thoughts, concerns, clarifications, diatribe, violent opposition? Yes.
More speeches early on in the Old Testament, and do they kind of peter out as
God speaking?
Yeah, God.
Yeah. The anytime God is speaking, we're using prophetic language. So the prophets are always the ones who are the mouthpiece, and so Moses is the natural place there where you get some nice long speeches. Anytime you get the prophets, you get nice long speeches. I mean, I think that Ezekiel only has one third person pronoun in the entire 48 chapters of Ezekiel. It's a dialogue with giant speeches between God and Ezekiel. So anytime the prophets are involved, you're going to get speeches from God. But the rest of the time, you're right. You don't get much. And after the prophets fall silent, you don't get the speeches after that. So, yeah.
Rob,
Yeah.
in terms of just the historical piece of
Sure.
this, the items that were described, the way that the building was described,
Mhm.
all of that, was that consistent with the pre-David kind, or was that, would that reflect the time of when it was written?
Oh, that's a good question. The practice of the kinds of things like the incense burners and the altars, I think you find those present in temples across the ancient Near East. I think that was a common way that people associated worship of the gods. I'm even thinking now of when I excavated at Bet Shan in '93. It's a late Bronze Age temple that we were underneath, and they had a roasting pit area there that was used to bring the sacrifices for a local group of temples on that site. So even Canaanite religions had these things, and so I don't know if they're distinct enough for us to make a determination like that. I mean, it would kind of be on some level. It's like, they have benches. Well, does that date it? Well, people have had benches a long time in a lot of places. I don't know that.
Yeah.
It's hard to know exactly on that, but
So are synagogues an Iron Age construct?
they are. Actually, they're even later. Synagogues are post-exilic. Most assume they're Persian, period. Most people assume the synagogue comes because when the temple is destroyed in 587 and they're taken off into captivity, the only way in which they can preserve religious identity is to come together in what we would think of as like house churches. And that's sort of the birth of the synagogue idea is the diaspora, when the Jews are spread out. So most believe synagogues to be a post-destruction, post-exilic Persian period probably development. Yeah, luckily the Babylonians allowed the Jewish exiles to live together. The Assyrians, when they exiled the northern kingdom, they spread them out in the empire to breed the problem away, basically. The Babylonians felt if people lived together, they wouldn't have the tendency to rebel, and so thankfully the southern kingdom was able to preserve their identity. And that's why the lost tribes of Israel are lost. They were lost ethnically in the Assyrian Empire. The Jewish identity comes from the people of Judah, which is where that term comes from, and comes as a result of living together in Babylon, and probably synagogue is one of the developments of that. This is a reconstruction of the tabernacle, just like you pictured, I'm sure. But this is actually at Timnah. Remember when I showed you the late Bronze Age temple that had the bronze snake of Jethro? That temple is right over here from this picture. This is reconstructed on that site at Timnah to try and get tourists, because it doesn't rain much here, and you won't have to worry about it causing problems. But you have the large covering here, the Petocha, I believe, the tarp that covers that area. The Holy of Holies is back in there. The word tabernacle is used for both the inside part and the whole thing. So both those things count. Reconstruction of a horned altar there And then they pack this whole thing up and take it with them whenever they move. What happens after they build the temple with it, we don't know. We do know that it was Shiloh for a long time, and Shiloh was destroyed. We don't know when Shiloh was destroyed. We just know that in Jeremiah, God says, remember when Shiloh was destroyed? So we know it was destroyed. We think that there is some evidence that the tabernacle was kept in the temple after the temple was built. At least they talked about it like that. And the question is whether or not they're simply talking about the temple like the tabernacle, or if they actually have the tabernacle in the temple. And I don't know what the answer to that question is, because then once the temple's destroyed, who knows? So.
Is that outer structure a part of it also?
Yeah, it is, because God is holy and you don't just get to wander into these places. In fact, the different tribes were ordered to camp around the area in a way to provide buffer. Basically, the closer you get in, the holier things get until you ultimately get into the Holy of Holies.
And how big is that? Like a football field or?
Oh, no, not at all. It's, let me try and remember. I think that this is 90 feet. I think, the long ways. I think.
That was an awful lot of
To quote.
ingredients, a list of things that they needed to build something like that.
Yeah.
How did the people get
Must
in
be
there?
fancy inside.
The front, well, you only the priests get to go in, so.
Well, even in the outer area?
Oh, no, they had to camp out here.
Okay.
Yeah, the camp part is out here. The special folks could go in here, but, yeah.
Who
you're
could
asking-
go in the Holy of Holies?
High priest, so Aaron at this point.
Sorry.
Where would they kill the animals?
On the altar, or near the altar.
Well, who built the Holy of Holies if only the high priest could go in it?
Oh, what normally happened was you had craftsmen to build things, and then there would be a moment of consecration that would make it holy, and now it's just, I mean, it was like when they used to build idols. You know, everybody knew, well, this is just built by a dude. It's not an idol. And so what would happen is they would build the idol, and then there would be this special opening of the mouth ceremony that now would make this idol a mouthpiece for God, and now it's special and no longer made by human hands. It's like that. Yeah.
And is the ark in there someplace?
Yeah, the ark would be in there. I don't think there's an ark in there, but there is an ark in there. I don't think that has an ark, but I do think
No,
the
it's
tabernacle.
because it's in
It's just
Ethiopia.
Yeah, right, right. Well, actually, I think it's in a warehouse someplace in Washington, as I recall from the movie. Yeah. But, yeah, and it's still, and we talked about this last week, it is still funny to me that God in Exodus 20 says, now, no graven images, nothing that's on the earth above or in heaven. And then he says, but when you build the ark, hey, put 2 cherubim on the top, because that's cool. It's like, you just said not to build images, and now we're supposed to put cherubim on the ark? And while you're at it, how about some stars and maybe the moon on the curtains? Because again, the tabernacle's creation, right? We're given that image of creation. But God is telling them to actually make representations of the things that he just told them not to make representations. So be careful about your systematizing rules, I guess, because sometimes there are exceptions when God makes them. So. All right, well, things are going really well. I mean, this is good. We've just had this great covenant, this great marriage ceremony. Israel says, we will be your people. God says, I will be your God. We've got the instructions for how God's going to do it. I think things are going really well. Exodus 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said, come make gods for us who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. Well, that didn't take long, did it? I mean, that's unfortunate in this story. Aaron said, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it into a mold. This is important, by the way. I want you to notice what Aaron does here. He forms it into a mold, because later on when he's caught, he tries to get out of this story with one of the lamest excuses ever. And that his excuse is refuted by formed it into a mold right here, okay, just FYI, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, this, I think that it might be better to read this is Elohim, O Israel. I don't think he's thinking of it as plural. Maybe they're thinking of it as plural. But I think that would be a better way to go. They are not believing that the calf brought them out of Egypt. They are believing the calf represents the God, that brought them out of Egypt. In other words, they are combining the worship of Yahweh with the worship of religions that use calves as their symbolism, fertility religions, very common in this area. So they're combining the religion of Yahweh with fertility religion. So this is the God that brought us out of the land of Egypt, one that we can see right here in front of us, that we can move and have access to. Because Moses, who was supposed to provide us access to this God, hasn't come back down from the mountain for a while, and so now we've got problems. So we need you to make this calf to give us this access. So it's a syncretized faith that they have here. Aaron, when he saw this, he built an altar before it. That's the way things are going. And Aaron made proclamation, tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh. So he is now syncretized, the worship of this calf with Yahweh. They rose early the next day, offered burnt offerings, brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel, which is probably a euphemism. This is a fertility religion image, and the word revel there, I think, leaves some room for what might actually be going on. Yeah?
What's the Hebrew when it says these are your gods?
It is plural. It is these are your. It is Elohim, but Elohim is a pronoun that is also used as a title.
Okay.
So you don't know whether it's.
So it could be either.
Yeah, we don't know if they mean this
Or
is
un.
Elohim. Exactly.
Yeah.
This is Elohim, or because in Genesis 1, Bereshit bara Elohim, and in the beginning God created. There we actually mean Yahweh, but here that word can mean a lot. It's the pronoun for God, and so sometimes you can use it as a title, and sometimes it just means God's. So, yeah. Well, this is a dark turn. And Aaron, I mean, any way the wind blows, doesn't really matter to him. I mean, he is completely spineless in this story. And he's spineless in later stories as well, by the way. Aaron has no spine in the story. Well, God saw this, surprising no one. The Lord said to Moses, go down at once. Your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way I commanded them. They've cast themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it, sacrificed to it, and said, these are your gods, you know he has to make a voice there. The Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation. God says, that's it. I'm killing everyone, except you. And we'll start this whole thing over. I have had it. Done. This is one of the funniest responses to me, to God, ever. I love this response. This is not the funniest story in the Wanderings. We'll get to that in Numbers, which is also a funny story, and evidence that God has a sense of humor. That's a teaser. But this, to me, is great. Moses responds by saying, but Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Did you catch this? What did God say? Let me go back. God says, your people, Moses, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. Moses says,
Your people.
I didn't bring them out of the land of Egypt. You brought them out of the land of Egypt. I didn't even want to go. My people have brought me. You did this with your mighty hand, I might add, oh God. Like I've got a mighty hand. Start with me on that, God. Why should the Egyptians say it was evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains, to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn, literally, repent from your fierce wrath, God. Change your mind and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and your Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land I promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. Oh, well, that was good. That was a close one. I love Moses' attempt to talk God out of this disaster, right? It's not, have mercy, O God. It's not, you are a forgiving God. It is, if you do this and kill everyone, the Egyptians are going to say, you were really mean. And, you've got a reputation. So maybe don't kill them. And on top of that, you promised to make a great nation, and you've already got a great nation. Why would you start over on this? Maybe don't. Maybe don't. And so God changed his mind. Nahum, relented. Some Bibles try to soften the translation, relented a little bit. But it is a word for repenting. It is a word for changing the mind, and that God does. God does this on several occasions. God had this word, Nahum is a word that is used in Jonah. It is used here. It is used a couple of other places. No, it's Psalm 90. It is sometimes used as, it's also a Hebrew word that means comfort. Comfort my people at the beginning of Isaiah 40 is this word Nahum. It's also Nahum's name, which personally I consider ironic because I hate Nahum and I don't see how it's a comforting book at all, but we'll deal with my issues another time. But that's what this word is. So it is a word that is used of God. Moses is the only one who gets away with telling God to change his mind. Other people try. Moses is the only one who is successful in talking God in from the ledge of killing everyone. But he gets away with it. He does it here. He does it in Numbers. This story is referenced in Psalm 90, where he does it again. Amos tries to talk God out of it. In Amos 7, some of you know the plumb line story in Amos, right? God opens that story by saying, I tell you what, I'm going to bring locusts on the earth. So many it eats every green thing because of the sin of Israel. And Amos is like, it's a little harsh, all the locusts. And God says, all right, I will bring fire that will consume all of the water on the earth. And Amos is like, again, I love the enthusiasm, a little harsh. And then God comes to Amos and says, look, here's a plumb line measuring Israel. I'm bringing a sword. So it's almost as though, look, they're out of plumb. I'm destroying them. And Amos says, all right, okay, fair enough. Okay, here's the grade book. They didn't make it, so sorry. But so Amos doesn't talk him out of eventually bringing judgment, but Moses does. Moses is successful in changing God's mind here. Prophet's responsibility is to bring God to the people and often to advocate for the people to God at the same time, and that's what he's standing in the gap here for the people. So, fun story. Isn't this a fun story? The ink's not even dry on the covenant, and Israel has broken it. As I tell the students, this is a marriage ceremony. Here is God, I will be your God, people, we will be your people, and God has just caught the bride in the closet with the best man. That is what has happened on this great day of the covenant. So, as the students point out, one student said to me, God has been in a dysfunctional relationship with these people from the very beginning. And I said, yeah, actually God has been in a dysfunctional relationship with humanity from the very beginning. So, and yeah, he just won't quit.
So I've seen the calf in movies. How big was it?
How big? Well, to quote Chevy Chase when he was impersonating Gerald Ford on Saturday Night Live, it was my understanding that there would be no math. I don't know. That's the answer to that question. Moses goes on down. Moses turned, went down the mountain, carrying some Bibles, and this is one of those times I need to help you with some Bible translations. This word that the RSV translates disaster. Some Bibles translate that evil. It is the Hebrew word for evil, okay? It is the Hebrew word that is usually translated evil. The interesting thing is they usually translate this as repent. And so this great verse that can cause people's brain to just blow up, and God repented over the evil he was going to do to Israel. It's a little too much for some people. Changed his mind over the disaster. Remember back when we talked about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The word evil in Hebrew, there are three words that you probably need to think of. Tov in Hebrew means good. Ra usually is translated as evil. Rasha means wickedness. Okay? God in the Old Testament can do Ra. He can do what we think of as evil. He cannot do Rasha. He cannot do wickedness. Evil doesn't have a moral quality to it in most understandings of the translation in the Old Testament. Wickedness does. Evil does not. And so evil would be plagues of Egypt, it would be punishments, it would be judgments. That is general unpleasantness. Disaster is a good translation of that word here. But if you have a Bible that says evil, don't get twisted about it. It is a word that just means a kind of unpleasantness that God is capable of doing. I think of it as connected to chaos. I do. I think of Tov as good, as order, like we have in Genesis 1, and it was good. And I think of Ra as chaos, as unbridled chaos in the world, which is in and of itself not wicked, but sometimes God will let chaos go, it seems, here in the Old Testament. This is one of those places. So, I don't know if that muddled things or helped things. Questions, comments? All right, Moses goes down, carrying the two tablets of the covenant in his hands, tablets that were written on both sides, the front and the back, in case you didn't know what both sides meant. That's Hebrew's helpful there. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved upon the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There's the noise of war in the camp." But he said, It's not the sound made by victors or the sound made by losers. It's the sound of revelers I hear. Same word, probably euphemistic. As soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, threw the tablets from the hands, and broke them at the foot of the mountain, took the calf that they had made, burned it with fire, ground it into powder, scattered it in the water, and made the Israelites drink it. There, that'll fix that problem. He ends up actually embodying what happens here. He breaks the covenant because Israel broke the covenant. It's a symbolic act of that here. Joshua, completely innocent in this story, doesn't even know what's happening.
So it's interesting, Moses ends up doing just what he talked.
Yes. He talked God out of it.
doing.
Yes. But he's not defending Israel in any way. And he talked God out of it by saying, you don't want people to think you're mean. And then he goes and says, I got this. And takes care of it himself. So
Has Joshua shown up before?
yes. He's mentioned a time or two. In Exodus? Yes, he is. He ends up guarding the tabernacle at some point. Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought so great a sin upon them? What do they have on you? How have you been compromised? And Aaron said, don't let the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people. They are bent on evil. They said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought up out of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. That is what they said to him. So he's reporting that accurately. So I said, whoever has gold, take it off. That's exactly what he said. So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. I mean, we just assumed that it was okay, because I throw the gold in the fire, and it was a calf. The only person in the history of the world, I think, that believes Aaron is Cecil B. DeMille. Because in that movie, I've watched it happen, he pours this gold into this pile of rocks, and they pull the pile of rocks away, and it's a perfectly shaped calf head. And I remember as a child going, well, that's the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen in my life. You can't get a calf head out of a pile of rocks. I had no idea at the time. He was believing Aaron. Like, I don't know, it just came out that way. We assumed it was okay, because God must have, well, I mean, that's a miracle, right? Have a calf head if you just pour it out. The dumbest lie ever. Anyway, Moses saw the people were running wild, for Aaron had let them run wild to the derision of their enemies. It's like when mom gets home after dad's been watching the kids. Doesn't that feel like this story to me? It feels like that story to me.
That's what I was just thinking. It sounds like the kids
Parenting,
making the.
yeah.
Can you what I don't. They like the chocolate cake for lunch. I didn't. Then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. He said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you. Go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp and kill your brother, your friend, and your neighbor. The sons of Levi did as Moses commanded. About 3,000 people fell on that day. Moses said, today you ordained for yourselves for the service of the Lord. This is the Levi's had. And each one the cost of a son or brother, so you brought blessing on yourselves this day. So judgment has come on Israel for being the way they are here. So that's.
I don't remember that one.
That wasn't in the movie, I don't think. The drinking of there's a lot of parts that are left out. On the next day, Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, but now I'll go to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, the people have sinned a great sin. They've made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will only forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of the book that you have written. The Lord said to Moses, whoever sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now, go lead the people to the place about which I've spoken to you. See, my angel shall go in front of you. Nevertheless, when the day comes for punishment, I will punish them for their sin. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf. So apparently when the time came was the next verse. The one that Aaron had made. So I love this contrast between the tabernacle and the golden calf. And I think it's an important connection between the two of these. When you look at what God had in mind when he thought about worship and what the people wanted when they thought about worship. The tabernacle, as I said, God's initiative. The offerings were requested. Remember, tell them to set aside an offering as their hearts lead them to bring these lists of things. There's painstaking preparation, a really long, boring reading process, and all of that. All of it is to safeguard divine access. Holy of Holies, guarded by the outer area, guarded by the courtyard, guarded by where people stay, to try and have this visible and personal God that wants to hang out with them. As opposed to the golden calf, which was people's idea. Aaron demands the gold, strip the gold off. Remember, he didn't say, if you've got gold, bring. No, that's what he said. That's not what he said. strip the rings off. There's no planning. They came up with it, quick construction. You get immediate divine access with a visible God that is actually represented by an impersonal object. It is actually direct contrast to what God had in mind for presence among the people and what the people were wanting at the end of the day. So I think there's a reason that the planning for the tabernacle and the building of the tabernacle is interrupted, I think, by this golden calf story. It shows the contrast in God's plan and human initiative here.
So the golden calf is before the tabernacle was built or after?
It's before it's built.
Built, after it's been.
After God has gone through all of
Laid
the
it out.
blueprints with Moses, yeah. So although it does, there does seem to be a moment, and now I can't remember what verse it is, in chapter 33, that suggests that the tabernacle is there during the golden calf incident. And so some wonder if this story has been dropped back in between for narrative purposes and told kind of in a flash forward for a narrative purpose, maybe. But yeah.
The implication is that Moses was in the mountain for a long time.
Yeah, it took a while.
40 years.
Yeah, people weren't patient. Yeah, yes,
Could you go back one screen?
maybe.
It's interesting that the Levites were the heroes,
Mm-hmm.
the loyal ones.
Mm-hmm.
That's the priestly class,
It
right?
is.
And that's the literate class too, right?
Probably.
The what
Yeah.
class?
Literate?
Okay.
Possibly. Yeah, I don't know what literacy level we have at this
But
point.
Aaron is a Levite, wasn't
He is, so is Moses. Well, yeah, because they're
he?
the same, they're brothers, so they
Okay,
have to be.
so-
Yeah, Moses is Levite and Aaron's Levite.
Okay, so this story was probably made by Levites then? we
One
can
would assume,
probably
yes, one would assume the Levites preserved this story, yeah. Most people, in the old source critical stories that Barbara still remembers from her seminary days, this would be P, because the priests are the ones who are gonna preserve these stories, this part of the story for sure. Yeah. I have always thought it was interesting, though, that Moses is a Levite, because, and this is one of those times when there is some historicity issues for me. In other words, I find it to be a historical feeling account. In other words, I believe there was a Moses, that's what I'm trying to say. Because the temptation would be to make Moses of the tribe of Judah, or one of the big tribes of the north, not to make him, I wouldn't think it'd be to make him a Levite. I mean, the spies go into the lands, and the two hero spies, Caleb and Joshua, one is of the tribe of Judah, one's of the tribe of Ephraim. They're of course, those are the guys who were faithful. But Moses being the tribe of Levi, that's an interesting, it's unusual to me that would happen. Like Saul being a Benjamin, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, oh, well, that's a weird tribe to be from. It must have some historicity to it. Because if you were telling the story, that's not the way you tell it. So, yeah.
So who got killed here?
The people that the Levites saw being bad, I guess. Yeah, use your judgment and then
Okay,
kill
yeah.
everybody that you see.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
It'll go on down,
It's
yeah.
one more screen, the brothers.
Oh, it's above it. Yeah, there it is.
Kill your brother, your friend, and your neighbor.
Yeah, brother, friend, and neighbor.
Yeah, well, that's a little vague.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Well, in
there's-
effect, those are sacrifices.
Yes, they're considering them. Yeah, it's just a judgment. This is seen as judgment. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a verse in there somewhere.
Oh, yeah?
Somewhere in the Bible.
Yeah,
where
thanks.
Children run wild to the derision of their enemies. This whole scene is kind of speaking almost metaphorically as like they're attempting not, they're a nomadic tribe, or they're among other peoples in the
Oh,
area.
people see them, yeah.
Yeah, there are other cultures around them.
Well, I
And
think
they're
without-
attempting not to assimilate their people, like this transition from a fertility religion to a purity religion.
Right, and I think that's the goal. The whole calf idea is telling us that they have exposure to other faith around them. Yes,
Yeah.
fertility faiths around them. Yeah, I think so. What else do I want to say? I think this is the big finish. No, this is 34. The Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will, so this time I'm not making the tablets for you. You give me tablets and I'll write them, but I made the tablets last time, you just broke them. So you said, you make the tablets. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning. A little subtweet there. Be ready in the morning, come up the Mount Sinai, present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and do not let anyone be seen throughout all the mountain. Don't let the flocks or the herds graze in front of the mountain. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, rose early in the morning, went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord commanded him, took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in a cloud and stood there with him, and proclaimed the name the Lord. God actually announces God's name here, Yahweh. The Lord passed before him and then proclaimed. Now, I will say that there is textual evidence that no one knows exactly who is speaking here. Some manuscripts say it's God who's speaking, some manuscripts say it's Moses who's speaking. Most manuscripts say it's God who's speaking, and that's what the tradition has accepted. So just FYI on that. You might have a footnote in your Bible. But God proclaimed, the Lord, Yahweh, Yahweh. God uses his name twice here at the beginning of this section. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting iniquity on the parents upon the children, the parents upon the children, the children's children, in the 3rd and 4th generation. This credo is incredibly important throughout the rest of the Old Testament. It is quoted in various ways, in various parts. The Psalm, 145, I believe, quotes parts of it, mostly the positive parts of it, God's abounding in steadfast love. Nahum quotes only the judgment parts in chapter 1. Jonah quotes the happy parts because Jonah's upset about it in chapter 4. So Jonah quotes the happy parts ironically in chapter 4 of Jonah, which is interesting. So very important credo throughout other portions of the text. We have 7 Hebrew verbs describing what God is like. So that's probably not an accident there. Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, faithfulness, keeping steadfast love, forgiving iniquity. Those are our 7 descriptions there. The word mercy, rahum, is very probably connected etymologically to the word for womb. And so it is a mothering kind of merciful love when we're talking about that. That image of that word is an image of nurture, mercy. Mothering love is the way a lot of people will translate that word merciful there. Gracious, the name for Hannah. Slow to anger. So in other words, God literally in Hebrew has a long nose. That's what slow to anger. Long nose, oh God. You don't want a short nose because that means quick to anger. You want a long nose. Apparently, most people assume there's an image here of like oxen or others that will snort when they get angry, that you don't want God to snort on Israel. You want a long nose that has time to cool down on that breathing. So I love the pictures of that. You know, it's just it's amazing. Anyway, what thoughts do you have? I have other things to say.
Seems
but I'll
like
stop
it's
this
quite a
time.
contrast to a hot burn.
It does, yeah.
There are 3 or 4 references to hot burn.
Yeah, hot burning anger. Yeah, that is a short nosed. I didn't bring it up earlier, but yeah, this is a long nose. So you've got to have a long nose for these people.
He's slow to anger and
Yes.
gracious and merciful.
Yes.
He visits the iniquity of their
Right.
parents up to the 4th
Well, it
generation.
really depends on where you are in the verse, because he also forgives iniquity. So it really just depends on what you're focusing on.
Mhm.
God forgiving iniquity, but never forgetting iniquity on the parents. So this contrast within this very same verse is not something that Jewish interpreters have ever felt the need to reconcile. That there are times in which God is forgiving, and there are times in which God is not so forgiving and not mocked, I think would probably be the better way to think about it. So I think God is forgiving but not mocked. It might be a good way to do that. But this word forgiving is a really neat word to me. It is the word nasa. It is the word to lift up. It is exactly the same word in the 10 Commandments for don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Don't lift up the name of the Lord in vain. Don't wear, don't carry, don't bear. It is also a word for forgive. So this word for forgiveness is actually a picture of lifting up. It's like lifting a burden in that word for forgiveness, which I just think is a beautiful, one of the things, I mean, snorting is pretty imagery filled as well, but I like the lifting vision in this section here. So
It's kind of a paradoxical God, isn't it?
Very
One
much.
that is merciful and forgiving,
Mhm.
but will punish the children
Now,
for the sins of the parents.
yeah.
the way
That's
I
not
had
fair.
No, it's not.
The way I had that explained to me one time was that when you think about it, well, wherever it was that I was reading that didn't have the word visiting in front of it, and just stated that it would be,
Yeah.
that children learn from their parents, and if their parents had bad faults, then the children were probably gonna do it too, and it might take a couple of generations for this to work its way out.
Bob asked the question a few weeks ago, that exact question about, is this a statement of the consequences of the parents' actions or biology, or is this a statement of God's intervention in and holding accountable to?
And your answer was?
I don't remember what I said. I'm sure it was brilliant. I don't remember what it was.
You're
exactly.
saying that because Bob's not here.
Bob's sitting in front of you.
Oh, that Bob. I'm sorry, I was thinking
Oh,
of
no,
Cedra.
not the Cedra, no, it was
Oh,
that
sorry.
Bob. who said
Okay.
it. Now, I mean, when I read this as God is not mocked. That's what I read this as, because that's what, when God gets angry, when God is not clearing the guilty and visiting, and there are consequences for generations for the sin of individuals, it is when there are individuals who have worn God's name, who've taken God's name, are making God look bad and mocking him, assuming that because they're God's people, they get special privilege, assuming that because they're God's people, they don't have to take care of the poor and the immigrant and the needy, that because they are God's people, they're safe in Jerusalem, and this is God's house, and he's never gonna let anything. That's when God doesn't forget, and that's when there are consequences to the people there. So for me, that has always to me seemed to be in the other stories directly connected to people who wear God's name badly. That is not an arbitrary cruelty at that point. But I will say that this, as Steve was pointing out, that this does seem, this contradictory image here is different than the kind of systematized gods that you get in other places. This God is a lot more complicated than a lot of other ancient Near Eastern gods, emotionally complicated in this. But these verbs always used to describe the nature of who God is here. The big finish, as we get to the big finish, the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, they didn't set out until the day it was taken up. The cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day. Fire was in the cloud by night before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey. That's the end of the book of Exodus as they're heading out. So God's presence is with the people and leading them and moving. Again, a portable deity is incredibly unusual. You don't see that anywhere else in the ancient Near East, that this God wants to hang out with people. Everything else, it seems all the other gods are based on separation. Top of the mountain, in the heavenly temples, top of towers. But here, God is in a tent, camping in the wilderness with the people. Always about tabernacling with us, no matter if it's the incarnation or it's the Hebrew Bible. That's the picture that you have of a Yahweh who cares and doesn't like being mocked. So what thoughts do you have? Questions, comments?
What time did it begin?
6.
We thought it was
6.
7 o'clock.
6.
Oh,
Yeah,
dear.
sorry you missed it. It was good.
Isn't that what it said?
Well, you'll be here in time for choir practice.
Yeah, choir practice is about to start.
That
so
starts at 7.
What's that?
I'm sure Ray will welcome
Time
you.
for choir practice.
That's right. That's right. So
Is Moses still not in?
Moses
Some of
does not enter into the tabernacle except he meets at the door of the tent whenever God shows up. When God wants to talk to Moses, they meet in the door. The Holy of Holies portion is where the high priest will go. So the tent of meeting is probably called the tent of meeting because that's where Moses would meet and have a conversation with God about what needs to happen next. Yeah. And then when they get in trouble, God does say to Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, come out to the tent of meeting, all 3 of you. It sounds just like a parent, say, all right, get on. Conversation. So, great story.
Are tablets of stone of any significance?
They're enduring. It was the main way you wrote. I mean, that was you had clay tablets, but tablets of stone are going to be more, you don't have to bake them. They're going to last longer.
Unless you drop them and break.
Unless you throw them at the base of the mountain at someone, and then they don't last as long. Yeah, that's true. That's true. They don't last as long at that point. So yeah, I mean, most of the tablets most of the writing that was done at this point was on wet mud with a stylus. It was cuneiform, and then they allow it to dry, and then you've got a good tablet. And if you're really lucky and you're an archaeologist, the place where they kept the tablets burned to the ground. That's what you really hope. And baked it so that it stays forever and doesn't turn back into mud at some point. But the stone tablets, obviously, those are for special, stylists, enduring words. Remember when in Job 19, when Job is having his great confession of faith, he says, "Oh, that my words were engraved with a pen forever." He's talking about using it on stone at that point, not in the mud. He's wanting it to endure. So I think that's the idea, is permanence.
Is this the only time that God wrote something?
Is this the only time God wrote something? Jesus scribbles in the dirt when the woman has been caught in adultery, which is the only example of Jesus writing, who I think is God. So that might be a loophole in that answer.
Yeah.
But I think so. Yeah, I think this is the only place where you get that. Yeah.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I see Exodus.
Yes.
Wasn't there a people called Lyxus, Lyksos, who
I don't know of them.
might have been
Oh, the Hyksos?
Oh, the Hyksos.
Hyksos?
The Hyksos, Hyksos. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
what about them?
They were in the time of Joseph. Thank you. In the time of Joseph in Genesis, they ruled Egypt from 1750 to 1550 BC, and they were foreign conquerors, and invaded Egypt and were kicked out by Ahmose the First in 1550 BC.
Oh, so they were there.
They would have been there about 300 years before these stories are set.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yes, sir.
So the, I don't want to say the speech, but the proclamation that God gives
Yes.
to Moses on the mountain.
The identity one, Yahweh one?
Yeah.
This one? Yeah.
Is like, I mean, we're setting that aside in prose, I assume, not
In
just
poetry.
because,
Yeah.
excuse me, yeah, in poetry first. Not just because God is speaking. I'm wondering, is there any textual evidence inside or like outside even the traditions that this was some kind of prayer recitation, something that predated the?
Yes. Well, okay. I'm gonna predated the exile. I will say yes.
Yeah.
I think that
That would predate the exile.
I think it is very likely that this is a recitation that is familiar, and of course you choose to believe when you see that worked into the story. Is this the first occurrence of it that then is carried on in the tradition, or is this inserted in the tradition at a later time when the text is written? However you want to understand that happening. Yeah, I think this was a credo that Israel is very familiar with. That's why I think you find it in the Psalm and in Jonah and in Nahum. And one of my good friends, his name is Nathan Lane. Hi, Nathan. He's not that Nathan Lane. This is another Nathan Lane. But he was a longtime roommate of mine whenever we went to SBL. Nathan and I both went to Baylor. He's a great guy. His work focused on this. This compassionate but avenging God, I think is the title of his dissertation. And it's tracing the use of that text all the way through. So if you're interested in that more, it's published by Whiffenstock Publishing. Compassionate but loving God, Nathan Lane. There, I got a plug for you, Nathan, so hope you're happy on that. So. Any other thoughts, concerns, comments?
This is all in the Bible, all these words?
These words are, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all text.
Everything you have up there?
All this is, yeah. Any of the white pages of the Bible. I got a good PDF of the biblical text, so this is the Bible and these are my notes. So. All right, well, we're done. So we will start, we'll do a book of Leviticus, probably just as I say, 1 week on Leviticus, unless I get real excited and want to do 2 weeks on Leviticus. But
Let's not.
I don't think I'll be that excited about Leviticus. I'll keep it going.
What time are you going to start?
6 o'clock next week.
Always
Start.
6.
So,
Always
always
6.
6, right on the line. So.
Okay.
See you then.
That's helpful.
In the website.
Well, yeah.